The first sign wasn't light. It was the sudden, impossible absence of fear in a universe that runs on it. Across the segmentum solar, 1 billion astropaths fell silent mid-scream. Their psychic chorus, that endless background radiation of terror and desperation, simply stopped. For 3 heartbeats, the warp itself held its breath. Then reality tore open above Terra, not with the usual violence of demonic incursion, but with something far more disturbing. A crack of perfect stillness, and through it stepped a being that had no right to exist in this nightmare galaxy. Whis had arrived in Warhammer 40K. He materialized in the void between Mars and Terra, suspended in the cold vacuum like a painting hung in Hell's Gallery. His staff glowed with soft purple light that didn't flicker or pulse with corruption. It simply was. Around him, the black of space seemed darker, as if the universe itself recoiled from his presence, but not in fear, in confusion. Whis stood perfectly still, his serene expression unchanging as he observed the Golden Throne's distant psychic screen. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone might when hearing an unfamiliar language for the first time. Below him, Terra burned with 1 trillion souls crying out in worship and agony. Above him, the eye of terror pulsed with malevolent hunger. Between these 2 cosmic extremes, Whis remained perfectly, impossibly calm. The Imperial defense grid went insane. Weapons platforms that had guarded Terra for 10,000 years suddenly registered an anomaly that fit no known classification. Not Daemon, not Xenos, not anything in their ancient databanks. Thousands of cogitators overheated trying to process what their sensors detected. A humanoid figure, biological, breathing, but radiating an energy signature that made their machine spirits whimper in binary confusion. High Lord Admiral Vandermar received 17 conflicting reports in 30 seconds. Some said it was an angel, others claimed it was a new chaos trick. The most disturbing report came from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Written in shaking handwriting, it feels like peace. If you want to see more impossible crossovers and explore what happens when cosmic beings collide with the grimdark universe, subscribe now, because what's about to unfold will challenge everything you know about power, corruption, and the warp itself. Hit that like button if you're ready to witness perfection meet apocalypse. On the Golden Throne, the Emperor stirred. For the first time in millennia, something had entered his domain that he couldn't immediately categorize. The master of mankind, whose psychic sight could pierce the webway and stare into chaos itself, felt the presence of Whis like a clean note in an eternal cacophony of screams. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't worshipful. It simply existed with a stability that the warp itself seemed to fear. The Emperor's consciousness spread thin across 1 million battles and binding rituals, contracted for just a moment to focus entirely on this newcomer. And in that moment of divine attention, every custodian in the Imperial Palace felt their spines lock with sudden primal awareness. Something had caught the Emperor's interest, something new. In the warp, 4 terrible intelligences turned their gaze toward the Imperium. Sinch saw a thread that didn't belong in his great tapestry, shimmering with a light that his magic couldn't touch or twist. The architect of fate leaned forward on his crystalline throne, 900 eyes blinking in sequence, intrigued by this puzzle wrapped in purple cloth and perfect posture. Khorne felt nothing from this being, no rage, no bloodlust, no warrior's pride, just a vast calm emptiness where emotion should burn. The blood god snorted in disgust but kept watching, suspicious of anything that felt no anger. Nurgle sensed an impossible cleanliness, a being untouched by entropy or decay, and for the first time in epochs, Grandfather Nurgle felt something close to envy. Slaanesh simply laughed, a sound like breaking glass and tearing silk, fascinated by something so perfect standing in a universe built on corruption. Whis blinked slowly, his eyes scanning the Imperial fleet assembling before him. 30 warships, each the size of a city, bristling with enough firepower to crack continents. Their weapons charged with the distinctive whine of plasma cores reaching critical mass. Through the void, challenge runes flashed in High Gothic, demanding identification and intent. Whis didn't respond. He was busy processing what his divine senses were telling him. This universe was wrong. Not evil, though it contained evil in abundance. Wrong, The fabric of reality here was damaged, torn, infected with something that fed on consciousness itself. He could feel it pressing against his aura like acid rain against glass, trying desperately to find a crack, a weakness, any way to seep inside and corrupt. It found nothing. The first salvo came without warning. Lance batteries that could boil oceans fired in synchronized fury, their energy beams crossing the void at light speed. Macro cannons followed, shells the size of hab blocks loaded with explosive cores hot enough to melt plasteel. The combined firepower could have destroyed a small moon. Whis raised one finger, not defensively, not dramatically. He simply raised it the way someone might to make a point in conversation, and every single weapon stopped. Not detonated, not deflected, stopped, frozen in space like insects in amber, suspended in a bubble of perfect stillness that even the warp couldn't penetrate. In the command deck of the flagship Eternal Vigilance, Captain Thaddeus stared at his tactical display and felt his faith in the Imperium crack just a little, because whatever stood before them wasn't playing by the rules of this universe, and in Warhammer 40k that was the most terrifying thing imaginable. The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds before the screaming started. Not from Whis, from the warp itself. Across 1,000 worlds, sanctioned psychers clutched their heads as visions flooded their minds. They saw a figure in purple robes standing in the void, surrounded by frozen fire and suspended death. But more terrifying than the figure was what surrounded him. Nothing. Absolute nothing. A sphere of reality so stable, so utterly devoid of warp influence, that it registered as a void within the void. Psychers who witnessed it through the Imperium began weeping uncontrollably. Some laughed. Others simply stared into the middle distance, muttering the same phrase over and over. The calm will kill us all. The Imperium had spent 10,000 years learning to survive in a universe soaked in corruption. They had no protocols for purity. Captain Thaddeus was a veteran of 3 Black Crusades and the War of the Beast. He had seen Daemon princes tear through battle cruisers like wet paper. He had watched entire fleets disappear into warp storms, never to return. But he had never in 40 years of service seen his weapons simply stop existing as threats. His tactical officer, a woman who had remained stone-faced through orbital bombardments and boarding actions, was trembling. Her fingers hovered over the firing controls, unable to process what her screens were telling her. Every weapon they had fired was still intact, still functional, still loaded with catastrophic energy. They just couldn't move, couldn't detonate, couldn't complete their purpose. Thaddeus opened a Vox channel to Terra, his voice carefully controlled despite the ice in his veins. Command, we have confirmed visual on the anomaly. Weapons ineffective. Request immediate intervention from... He paused, unsure how to finish that sentence. What do you call when you need something beyond the Adeptus Custodes? On Terra, the response was already mobilizing. The 10,000, the Emperor's personal guard, began their march through the golden halls of the Imperial Palace. Each custodian was a work of genetic art, superior even to the Space Marines, crafted personally by the Emperor's own hand. They moved with purpose but not panic, their guardian spears humming with dormant power fields. At their lead walked Captain General Trajan Valoris, Lord Commander of the Imperium's final defense. His armor, worked with gold and precious adamantium, caught the light of 1 billion candles as he strode toward the throne room. He had served for centuries. He had stood in the Emperor's presence countless times. But today even he felt the weight of uncertainty. The order was simple: observe, assess, and if necessary, eliminate. The problem was that third option. How do you eliminate something that makes your weapons forget how to kill? Terra's orbital space began to fill with golden light. 30 custodian warships translated from high anchor, their warp drives screaming as they pushed toward Whis' position with impossible speed. These weren't the crude, blocky vessels of the Imperial Navy. These were works of art and death combined, each one built during the Great Crusade when humanity still remembered how to dream. Their weapons were archaeotech, pre-heresy marvels that could unravel molecular bonds or freeze time itself in targeted spaces. If the Imperium had an answer to the impossible, it was this fleet. They formed a sphere around Whis, not attacking yet, just containing, watching, Through their sensors, 1,000 eyes studied this strange being, and through those same sensors, Whis studied them back, his expression still serene, still curious, still utterly unafraid. The Chaos Gods were not so patient. In the warp, Tzench moved first, as he always did. The architect of fate reached out with a tendril of pure change, wrapping it around the material realm where Whis stood. In 1,000 other situations, this would cause mutations, transformations, uncontrolled evolution. Flesh would warp, metal would rust and reform. Reality would bend to the changer of Whis' will. But the tendril touched Whis' aura and simply dissolved, not destroyed, but unable to maintain coherence in the face of such overwhelming stability. Tzench pulled back, surprised, intrigued, delighted. This was a puzzle that fought back. He leaned closer to the veil between worlds, his 900 eyes focusing in sequence, each seeing a different possibility, a different outcome. In 90% of timelines, Whis became a variable that destroyed everything Tzench had planned. In the other 10%, he became the most valuable piece on the board. The Chaos God smiled with a beak that had no right to smile. Khorne's reaction was more direct. The Blood God had no patience for mysteries that didn't bleed. He sent a vision to his champions across the galaxy, a simple image, a being in purple robes standing untouched by violence. The message was clear: make it bleed. Across 100 war zones, Khorne's chosen warriors suddenly paused mid-battle, their eyes focusing on something only they could see. Khorne the betrayer, butchering his way through an ultramarine strike force on the daemon world of Sicarius, stopped swinging Gorechild and looked up at the sky. For the first time in 10,000 years, the betrayer smiled beneath his helmet. A new challenge, a new skull for the Skull Throne. But even as bloodlust surged through his veins, something deeper, something almost forgotten, whispered a warning. This prey was different. This prey might be predator. In the webway beneath Terra, the Emperor's presence manifested as golden light seeping through ancient Eldari construction. The master of mankind had not moved from the Golden Throne in 10 millennia. His body a withered corpse kept alive by psychic will and 1,000 dying psychers every day. But his consciousness was vast, spread across the galaxy like a net, burning light. And right now, every fragment of that consciousness was trying to understand what stood above his throne world. The Emperor had met gods before. He had bargained with them, fought them, outsmarted them. He had walked among them during the dark age of technology, when humanity touched divinity and burned for their hubris. But Whis was different. The Emperor's psychic sight, which could peer through time and space, which could see the strands of fate itself, hit a wall when it touched this being. Not a hostile wall, just absolute certainty. Whis was here. Whis was real. Beyond that, even the master of mankind could not see. Whis finally spoke. His voice carried across the void without vox equipment, without psychic projection, simply because he chose for it to reach the listeners. Interesting, he said, his tone contemplative and mild, like someone sampling an unfamiliar tea. Your universe has rules I haven't encountered before. Your reality is damaged, torn. He glanced toward the Eye of Terror, that vast wound in space where the warp bled through into reality. I can see the infection from here. It feeds on emotion, doesn't it? Fascinating. He turned his attention to the custodian fleet surrounding him, studying their ships with academic interest. And you've built an entire civilization around containing it. How long have you been fighting this war? The question hung in the void like a blade. Because for the Imperium, the answer was simple and terrible: forever. They had been fighting forever, and they would fight forevermore. Until Whis' arrival, they had never considered that someone might exist who didn't have to. The Emperor's response came not as words, but as pressure. Pure, overwhelming psychic force that rolled across the solar system like a tidal wave of golden fire. Every human within 1,000 light years felt it. A momentary flash of their god's attention focused elsewhere. Pilgrims on Terra fell to their knees weeping. Navigators in the warp screamed and covered their third eyes. Battle sisters paused mid-prayer, feeling the Emperor's presence contract and then expand with terrible purpose. This was the master of mankind reaching out directly, something he rarely did anymore, too busy holding back demons in the webway and guiding the Astronomicon across the galaxy. But for Whis, the Emperor made an exception. The psychic message crashed into Whis like a battering ram wrapped in silk, carrying 10,000 years of authority, divine judgment, and a single imperative: identify yourself. Whis tilted his head, the gesture so casual it bordered on disrespectful. The psychic force that would have turned lesser beings into gibbering wrecks or exploded their minds entirely washed over him like summer rain. He examined it with the same mild curiosity he'd shown everything else, turning it over in his perception the way someone might examine an interesting stone. "Ah," Whis said softly, "you're the central authority here, the one they call Emperor." He paused, and for the first time since arriving, his expression shifted slightly. Not quite concern, but something approaching it. "You're dying." "No, worse than dying. You're being consumed slowly, piece by piece, to maintain." He gestured toward the Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse burning in the warp. "That beacon. How long has this been happening?" The question wasn't accusatory, it was genuinely curious, and somehow that made it worse. In the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Custodes felt their master's rage through their psychic connection. Not anger at the question, but fury at the situation Whis had identified so effortlessly. The Emperor had spent 10 millennia in agony, his sacrifice known only to his closest servants, his pain shared by none, and this stranger had diagnosed it in seconds. Captain General Valoris felt his jaw tighten behind his helmet. Around him, the 10,000 stood ready, their guardian spears crackling with energy that could unmake demons and shatter reality itself. But the order to attack never came. Instead, the Emperor sent another message, this time shaped into something resembling language. Images flooded through the psychic link: the Horus Heresy, the siege of Terra, the Emperor's broken body being interred on the Golden Throne, 10,000 years of sacrifice. The message was clear: this is the price of survival. Whis absorbed the information without flinching, his eyes distant as he processed the history of an entire civilization in heartbeats. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight it hadn't before. "I see. You wounded yourself to save your species. Noble." He looked directly at Terra, and though he stood thousands of kilometers away in the void, every custodian in the palace felt his gaze. "But ultimately futile. Your universe is collapsing inward. This warp, this infection you're fighting, it's not an invader, it's a symptom. Your reality itself is sick, and you're treating the fever while ignoring the disease." He raised his staff, pointing it not at Terra but at the Eye of Terror. "That wound has been there for millennia. It's growing, slowly but growing. At this rate, your galaxy will be consumed entirely within 10,000 years. Perhaps less." The declaration hit the Imperium like a thunderstrike. Not because it was new information. The Adeptus Mechanicus had projections. The Inquisition had models. Every high-ranking official knew in their darkest moments that the Imperium was dying, but they never said it aloud. They never acknowledged it. To do so would be heresy, would be despair, would be the final nail in humanity's coffin. Yet here was this stranger, this impossible being, stating their secret doom as casually as commenting on the weather. Across Terra, Vox channels erupted with confused orders and panicked demands. Should they silence him? Could they silence him? Could they silence him? And if they could, would that make the truth any less real? Captain Thaddeus, still in orbit aboard the Eternal Vigilance, found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a child, praying for guidance. Not the rote prayers of the Imperial Creed, but genuine, desperate prayer. The Chaos Gods were laughing now. In the warp, their mirth echoed across impossible dimensions, shaking the foundations of reality. Slaaneish's laughter was musical and cutting, delighted by the emotional turmoil spreading through the Imperium. Nurgle chuckled wetly, pleased that even this perfect being could see the inevitable decay. Sinch cackled with plans within plans, already weaving this new variable into schemes that wouldn't pay off for centuries. Even Khorne allowed himself a satisfied growl. The stranger had struck a blow without raising a weapon, had wounded the Imperium's pride more deeply than any demon invasion. But their laughter died when Whis turned his attention to the warp itself. His eyes focused on the immaterium, seeing beyond the veil that separated reality from the realm of souls and nightmares. And in that moment, the Chaos Gods realized something terrifying. Whis wasn't intimidated by them, he was disappointed. Parasites, Whis said quietly, though his voice somehow carried through the warp itself, reaching the ears of demons and gods alike. You feed on suffering but create more of it to sustain yourselves, an endless cycle with no purpose except perpetuation. He studied the Eye of Terror with clinical detachment. You're not even truly alive. Your patterns, echoes, reflections of mortal emotion given form and consciousness. He tapped his staff against empty space, and the sound rippled through both reality and the Imperium. In my universe we have rules about entities like you, rules about interference, rules about balance. For the first time since arriving, Whis' expression hardened just slightly. You've broken every rule that matters. You've taken a species capable of extraordinary things and trapped them in perpetual torment. Why? The warp didn't answer with words. It answered with violence. A tendril of pure chaos not aligned to any single god but all of them at once, lashed out from the Eye of Terror. It moved faster than light, faster than thought, carrying enough corrupt power to turn solar systems inside out. It was the warp's immune response, the galaxy's infection trying to destroy the thing that threatened it. The tendril struck Whis dead center, wrapping around him in coils of impossible color and maddening geometry. Reality screamed. Space-time buckled. For a single instant the Imperium dared to hope that their universe's own hostile physics would do what their weapons could not. That hope lasted exactly 3 seconds before Whis raised his hand, grasped the tendril of chaos like it was a physical rope and pulled. The warp shrieked. The chaos gods recoiled, and Whis, still perfectly calm, spoke 4 words that would echo through the Imperium for centuries. No, that won't work. The tendril dissolved, not destroyed, but dismissed, rejected so completely that it simply ceased to be relevant. Whis brushed his robe as if removing dust, his serene expression returning. I see, he said, speaking to the galaxy at large, to the Emperor, to the Chaos Gods, to every terrified soul watching through scopes in psychic sight. You wanted to test my nature, to see if I could be corrupted, controlled, or destroyed. He smiled. A gentle expression that somehow carried more menace than any demon's leer. I cannot, but I understand your fear. In a universe where everything can be twisted, where even your gods are slaves to emotion and entropy, something stable must seem like a threat. He turned his full attention to Terra, to the Golden Throne, to the Emperor dying by inches. I will offer you this once. I can heal him. I can restore your Emperor to full strength, undo 10,000 years of decay in a single moment. All you need to do is ask.
Silence fell across Terra like a shroud. 10 billion souls held their breath without knowing why. In the Imperial Palace, Captain General Valoris stood motionless, his enhanced mind racing through 10,000 scenarios and finding no precedent for this moment. The offer hung in the air like a loaded bolter pressed against humanity's temple. Heal the Emperor. Restore him to the glory he held during the Great Crusade when he walked among men as a living god. Return him to the strength that unified Terra, conquered the stars, and nearly brought the galaxy to heel. It was everything the Imperium had prayed for across 10,000 years of suffering. It was salvation wrapped in purple robes and delivered by a being they didn't understand. And that was precisely why it was the most dangerous thing they'd ever been offered. The High Lords of Terra convened an emergency session within minutes, their council chamber sealed by enough wards and protective rituals to make demons weep. 12 of the most powerful humans in the galaxy sat around an ancient table, and for once none of them spoke. They simply stared at each other, the weight of Whis' offer crushing down on their shoulders like a cathedral made of impossible decisions. Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum broke the silence first, his voice rough from a lifetime of screaming orders across battlefields. We accept. Immediately, without hesitation, he slammed his augmetic fist on the table, leaving a dent in wood older than some civilizations. 10,000 years of bloodshed, and you want to debate? Our God can walk again. We accept. His words echoed in the chamber, and for a moment it seemed like the decision would be unanimous. Then the inquisitorial representative spoke. No, the word fell like a judge's gavel. The Inquisitor, whose name was classified even from the other High Lords, leaned forward into the candlelight. Half their face was hidden behind a mask of office. The other
half showed burn scars from fighting daemons in the Eye of Terror. We know nothing about this being, nothing about his methods, nothing about his price. They gestured to the chamber's ceiling, where beyond plasteel and stone, Whis waited in the void. He appears from nowhere, dismisses our weapons, speaks directly to the Emperor, and offers a miracle. In our experience, such offers always have a cost, always. The Inquisitor's visible eye gleamed with cold logic. What if healing the Emperor requires warp energy? What if it binds him to this stranger's will? What if it's a chaos trick we simply don't recognize? We cannot afford faith. We can only afford certainty. The argument erupted like a plasma core reaching critical mass. Voices rose, accusations flew, and beneath it all the terrible truth simmered. They were arguing about their god's life while that god listened from his throne. The Fabricator General of Mars contributed cold calculations, showing that a restored emperor would increase the Imperium's survival probability by 800%. The Ecclesiarch countered that accepting aid from an unknown Xenos or daemon would be the ultimate heresy, damning humanity's soul even as it saved their god. The Grand Provost Marshal demanded they simply kill Whis, consequences be damned. The Master of the Administratum pointed out they had no evidence they could kill him. Around and around the argument spiraled, each High Lord speaking from genuine conviction, each one terrified they might make the wrong choice. Because in Warhammer 40k, the wrong choice doesn't just kill you, it kills everything you've ever loved across 10,000 worlds. Meanwhile, on the Golden Throne, the Emperor made his own calculations. Through dying eyes that could still see the strands of fate, he examined Whis from every angle his fragmented consciousness could perceive. The Emperor had lived for over 40,000 years. He had been a shaman, a warlord, a prophet, a god. He had bargained with the chaos gods themselves before the heresy, walked into their realm and emerged alive. He knew power when he saw it, and he recognized truth when he heard it. Whis could heal him. That wasn't a lie or a trick. The being's offer was genuine, made with the same casual confidence someone might offer directions to a lost traveler. But the Emperor also saw something else, something that made his withered fingers tighten on the armrests of the Golden Throne. If he accepted, he would owe, not explicitly. Whis hadn't demanded payment, but the Emperor understood cosmic balance better than any living being. Power didn't flow without consequence. Healing didn't happen without cost. And accepting aid from this stranger would create a debt that might destroy everything he'd built. The Emperor's response came through the custodians, his will transmitted through their psychic connection and spoken by Valoris's lips. The Captain General activated his Vox on all Imperial channels, his words reaching from Terra to the farthest edge of the galaxy. The Emperor declines. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. Valoris had served for centuries, had seen the Emperor's body waste away inch by agonizing inch, had fed the Golden Throne with 1,000 psychers daily just to keep the Astronomicon burning, and now he was refusing salvation. His voice nearly broke as he continued. The Master of Mankind thanks you for your offer, stranger, but humanity's path is our own. Our suffering is our own. Our salvation, if it comes, will be earned by our hands alone. We cannot accept aid we do not understand from power we cannot judge. This is the Emperor's will. In orbit, Whis tilted his head again, that same gesture of mild surprise. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the custodian fleet began to wonder if he would attack in response to the rejection. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not mockingly, not sadly, but with what appeared to be genuine respect. Interesting choice, Whis said, his voice carrying approval rather than disappointment. In my experience, civilizations this desperate usually accept any lifeline offered. The fact that you refused, that you chose suffering you understand over salvation you don't, shows wisdom I didn't expect to find here. He lowered his staff, the purple glow dimming slightly. Your Emperor is wise. The debt for such healing would indeed be substantial, not in servitude or worship, but in changed fate. He would owe the universe a service, and in a cosmos this damaged, that service might require choices he's unwilling to make. The revelation hit the Imperium like a second shock. Whis had just confirmed their fears while simultaneously praising their caution. The offer had been genuine, but the cost would have been real. What kind of being warns you about the price of their own gift?
What kind of power operates with such casual honesty? Captain Thaddeus, still watching from the eternal vigilance, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, curiosity untainted by fear. This Whis wasn't an enemy, wasn't an ally either. He was something else entirely, something that operated by rules the Imperium couldn't comprehend, in a framework where healing and debt, power and service existed in balance rather than conflict. It was so fundamentally alien to the Imperium's experience that it almost qualified as heresy. Almost, but not quite. Whis turned his attention away from Terra, gazing instead toward the outer rim of the galaxy. Since you've declined my assistance, I'll continue my observation. Your universe is fascinating if tragic. I'd like to understand it better before I return to my own. He began to drift away from the solar system, moving without propulsion, simply choosing to be elsewhere, in reality accommodating him. I won't interfere further unless asked directly. Consider me a tourist. He paused, glancing back at Terra one final time. Though I would recommend you find a permanent solution to your Emperor's condition. The current arrangement is unsustainable. You have perhaps 5,000 years before the Golden Throne fails completely, and when it does, you'll lose both your god and your lighthouse. Plan accordingly. Then he was gone, not vanishing, but simply moving too fast for their sensors to track, heading toward the eastern fringe with purpose that suggested his tour of Warhammer 40K was only beginning.
Whis emerged from the warp 3 weeks later near the Damocles Gulf, though calling it emerging from the warp wasn't quite accurate. He had traveled through it the way someone might walk through fog, unbothered by the daemons that fled from his presence, or the cosmic horrors that watched him pass with something approaching reverence. He hadn't been corrupted, hadn't been lost, hadn't even been particularly inconvenienced. He simply arrived at his destination and stepped back into reality, like crossing a threshold between rooms. Before him stretched the tall empire, that young and optimistic civilization that still believed the galaxy could be saved through unity and technology. Their clean white cities and organized fleets stood in stark contrast to the Imperium's Gothic excess. Whis studied them with renewed interest. Here was something different, something that hadn't yet been broken by 10,000 years of despair. The Tal had detected him immediately. Their sensor networks, sophisticated and efficient in ways that made Imperial equipment look like stone axes, registered an anomaly approaching their border worlds. No ship, no engine signature, just a humanoid figure moving through space at speeds that violated every known law of physics. Commander Shadowsun, leading a defense fleet near the Sept world of Dalith, received the alert with characteristic Tala composure. She ordered her fleet into defensive formation, weapons primed but not firing. The Tal Empire had learned caution in its dealings with the greater galaxy. They had encountered Imperium zealots, orc warbands, tyrannid swarms, and worse. They knew that shooting first and asking questions later was often the only way to survive, but something about this contact felt different. The reading showed no hostility, no weapons, just presence. Shadowsun made a decision that would define the next chapter of Talith history. She sent a diplomatic hail instead of a torpedo spread. Whis received the message with pleasant surprise. The Tal language was elegant, precise, built for clarity rather than poetry. The message was simple: identify yourself, state your purpose, and be welcomed if your intentions align with the greater good. Whis responded in perfect Talith, having learned the language from the transmission itself in the seconds it took to reach him. My name is Whis. I'm an observer from another reality. I mean no harm to your civilization. I'm simply curious about how different species in this galaxy survive its particular challenges. The response caused immediate confusion on Shadowsun's command ship. The being spoke Talith better than some Talith, claimed to be from another reality, as casually as stating a home address, and was approaching alone, unarmed, with what appeared to be genuine academic interest. In Shadowsun's experience, nothing in this galaxy was that simple. The Talith's response was methodical and careful. They dispatched a diplomatic vessel, a sleek crisis-class cruiser designed for first contact scenarios. Aboard was Borjal Shior, a water-caste diplomat who had negotiated with Imperium governors, crude chieftains, and even an Eldari Farseer once. She was prepared for almost anything. Almost. When she entered the observation deck and saw Whis floating outside her ship, staff in hand, expression serene, She felt something she rarely experienced, complete uncertainty about how to proceed. He looked humanoid enough, 2 arms, 2 legs, bipedal stance, but the way he existed in vacuum without protection, the way space seemed to bend slightly around him, the absolute calm radiating from his presence, these were not features of any species she'd encountered. She activated the external vox and spoke carefully. "Greetings, Whis. I am Porgel Shior of the Tal Empire. We welcome peaceful visitors. Would you be willing to come aboard and discuss your observations?" Whis smiled and simply appeared on the observation deck, bypassing the airlock entirely. One moment he was outside, the next he stood beside Porgel Shior, his arrival so smooth and natural that the ship's sensors never registered a breach. The diplomat froze, her hand instinctively moving toward her pulse pistol before training and discipline took over. She bowed instead, deeply, the tallest gesture of respect for a superior, not because she thought Whis was superior in value, the greater good taught that all beings had worth, but because she recognized power when it stood 3 feet away from her. "Fascinating ship," Whis commented, looking around with genuine interest. "Your technology is remarkably advanced compared to the Imperium I just left. Cleaner, more efficient, less," he paused, searching for the right word, "less miserable." Porgel Shior felt a flutter of pride at that, though she kept her expression neutral. The Talis were proud of their civilization. They had every right to be. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Talis diplomatic history. Whis asked questions about the greater good philosophy, about Talis history, about their technology and social structure. He listened with perfect attention, never interrupting, never judging, simply absorbing information with that same mild curiosity he'd shown everything else. Porgel Shior found herself explaining concepts she'd never had to justify before. Why do the Tal expand? To bring unity and prosperity. Why do they fight? To defend themselves and liberate those suffering under oppressive regimes. What is their ultimate goal? A galaxy united under the greater good, where all species thrive in harmony. Whis nodded along, his expression thoughtful. Then he asked the question that would haunt Porgel Shior for the rest of her life. And what happens when you encounter a species that doesn't want to be unified, that prefers their own path even if it leads to suffering? The question hung in the air like a blade, because the Talis had encountered such species many times, and the answer wasn't as clean as their philosophy suggested. Sometimes they negotiated, sometimes they withdrew, and sometimes when the greater good demanded it, they conquered, for the benefit of all, they told themselves, to save those species from themselves. But Whis' question stripped away the comfortable rhetoric and exposed the raw truth underneath. The Tal Empire, for all its enlightenment and progressivism, still ultimately chose for others what they believed was best. It was benevolent tyranny, perhaps softer than the Imperium's brutal authoritarianism, but it was still a choice made by the powerful for the powerless. Porgel Shior opened her mouth to respond, to explain the nuance, the complexity, the genuine good the Tal achieved. But before she could speak, alarms began shrieking throughout the ship. The warp had just vomited something terrible into real space. A chaos warband the Crimson Reavers had translated from the Imperium less than 1,000,000 kilometers away. 8 ships, corrupted and twisted, decorated with the trophies of 1,000 raids and painted with blood that never quite dried. They were Khorne worshippers, world eaters, descendants, and they had one purpose: kill until nothing remained. The Talis fleet immediately shifted to combat posture, railguns charging, shield generators humming online. But everyone on Shadow Sun's command deck knew the truth. 8 Chaos cruisers against their defensive fleet was a fight they'd likely lose. The Crimson Reavers were legendary butchers, and Talis technology, for all its sophistication, struggled against warp-corrupted ships that didn't obey the normal rules of combat. Poor Shior looked at Whis, desperate hope flickering in her eyes. "You said you were an observer. Does that extend to not observing civilizations being slaughtered?" Whis tilted his head, considering her words. Then he spoke a single sentence that would change everything. "That depends. Are you asking for help?" The choice crystallized in poor Shior's mind instantly. Asking meant debt, meant obligation, meant admitting that Tala couldn't handle this threat alone. It meant everything the Imperium had feared when they refused Whis' offer. But unlike the Imperium, the Talis were young,
pragmatic, not yet broken by 10,000 years of paranoia. And most importantly, poor Shior could see the Crimson Reavers beginning their attack run on Dallas, where 3 billion Talus citizens lived without the faintest idea that Khorne's fury was descending on them. She made her choice in the space between heartbeats. Yes, we're asking, please help us. Whis' smile widened just slightly, and for the first time since arriving in Warhammer 40k, he raised his staff with intent. Very well, I'll make this quick. I find pointless violence tedious, and your enemy seems to specialize in it. Then he was gone, moving through space toward the Chaos Fleet with purpose that suggested the Crimson Reaver's legendary reputation was about to become their epitaph. Lord Carrick's the blood-soaked stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Endless Carnage, and felt his twin hearts pound with anticipation. 8,000 years of slaughter had not dulled his love of violence. 8,000 years of offering skulls to Khorne had only sharpened his hunger for more. Below him, Dallas waited, its clean cities ripe for burning, its billions of souls ready to scream. The Talus were weak, in his estimation. They fought from distance with their cowardly technology, never tasting the glory of close combat, never feeling warm blood splash across their faces. Today, Carrick's would teach them what real war meant. Today he would paint their white cities red and add 3 billion skulls to the Skull Throne. Then his sensors detected something approaching. A single figure, moving through the void without a ship. Carrick's laughed, a sound like grinding metal and breaking bones. They send one warrior to face us. The Tal insult themselves. The Crimson Reavers opened fire with everything they had. Plasma cannons superheated by demonic essence. Macro batteries blessed by the Blood God. Torpedoes filled with virus bombs and forbidden weapons. The combined firepower was enough to crack a moon in half, to boil atmospheres and melt continents. It converged on Whis from 8 different angles simultaneously, a killing field that nothing should survive. Whis didn't dodge, didn't raise shields, didn't even slow down. He simply moved his staff in a small circle, and every weapon fired at him curved away, redirected with such casual precision that the torpedoes ended up destroying each other while the energy beams dissipated into empty space. The entire salvo, enough death to end civilizations, neutralized with a gesture that took less effort than swatting a fly. On the Endless Carnage, Carrick stopped laughing. His corrupted face, twisted by millennia of chaos worship, showed something it rarely displayed: confusion. Whis arrived at the first Chaos ship, a corrupted battle cruiser named the Skullbreaker, and simply touched it. Not struck, not punched, touched. His finger made contact with the hull and the ship stopped. Every system shut down simultaneously. Engines died. Weapons went cold. Life support ceased. The Danians bound into the ship's machine spirit shrieked once and were dismissed. Not destroyed, but sent back to the warp with enough force that they'd take centuries to reform. Inside the ship, 2,000 Chaos Space Marines suddenly found themselves drifting in a dead vessel, their armor's power supplies failing, their corrupted augmetics going silent. They were world eaters engineered for eternal rage, psychologically incapable of fear. But in that moment, floating in the darkness of their dying ship, they felt something close to it. Because whatever had just touched their vessel wasn't an enemy they could understand. It was something that operated on rules that made their chaos look like order. Khorne felt it through the warp, through the connection he maintained with every one of his warriors. Something had just nullified a ship full of his chosen. Not killed them, nullified them, made them irrelevant with a touch. The Blood God rose from his throne of brass and skulls 8 times the height of a titan and roared his fury across the Imperium. The sound shook Danyan worlds and made the other Chaos Gods pause in their eternal scheming. Khorne had been dismissive of Whis before, uninterested in a being who showed no rage or bloodlust. But this was different. This was a warrior, clearly, despite the serene appearance. And more importantly, this was a warrior who had just humiliated his servants. Khorne's rage crystallized into focus. He wanted this being's skull, not because Whis had killed his champions. Death in battle was honor, but because Whis had made them look weak, had treated them like insects beneath notice. That was an insult that demanded response. Whis moved to the second ship, then the third, touching each with that same casual precision. The Chaos Fleet, legendary terror of the Eastern Fringe, was dismantled like a child's toy by someone who wasn't even trying. Commander Shadow Sun watched from her command deck, her disciplined calm mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. She had fought chaos before, had seen their corruption, their impossible powers, their ability to make reality screen and bend. The Talmon had developed entire tactical doctrines around fighting warp-touched enemies, knowing that conventional warfare often failed against dangings and sorcery. But Whis was showing them something they'd never considered, that chaos could simply be irrelevant if you existed on a different level entirely. It wasn't resistance, wasn't counter-magic, it was just fundamental incompatibility, like trying to infect a rock with a disease. The disease might be deadly, but the rock simply doesn't care. Lord Carrick's made his decision with the directness of a true Khorne champion. If ranged weapons failed, if the ship itself was useless, then he would do what he always did, attack personally. He teleported himself and his first company directly into space. 200 world eaters in corrupt, tactical dreadnought armor, each one a walking tank of rage and ceramite. They materialized around Whis in a sphere of death, chainixes screaming, bolt pistols roaring, every weapon aimed at the center target. Carrick's himself swung his danging blade, Gorfi, a weapon that had ended the lives of saints and heroes, that had drunk the blood of 10,000 champions. The blade descended toward Whis' neck with enough force to split a land raider in half. It stopped 1 inch from contact, not blocked, it stopped. Whis hadn't even looked at. He was studying the world eaters with that same curious expression, like an entomologist examining interesting beasts. Fascinating, Whis said, his voice carrying through the void despite the lack of atmosphere. You've been surgically altered to remove your capacity for fear and enhance your aggression, combined with warped corruption that feeds on anger to sustain itself, a perpetual rage machine. He finally turned his attention to Carrick's, to the danging blood, frozen in mid-swing, to the Chaos Lord trembling with the effort of trying to move his weapon forward. But what happens when you encounter something your rage can't affect? When your anger has no target because your enemy isn't participating in your emotion? Whis tapped Gorfi with one finger, and the danging bound within the blade screamed as it was ejected from the weapon. The sword crumbled to rust in Carrick's hands. 10,000 years of danging power undone in a heartbeat. You become empty. Just biological machines running a program you can't escape. How sad. The other world eaters charged en masse, 200 warriors attacking with synchronized fury. Whis sighed, not with anger or frustration, but with genuine disappointment. You won't stop, will you? Your conditioning won't let you. He raised his staff and spun it once, just once. A wave of purple energy expanded outward from him in a perfect sphere, moving at the speed of thought. It passed through every world eater simultaneously, and they all stopped moving. Not dead, not unconscious, simply stopped. Their armor locked in place, their weapons froze mid-swing, their hearts still beat, their lungs still breathed. But they couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't rage. For the first time in 8,000 years, Lord Carrick's, the blood-soaked, experienced something he thought he'd lost forever during the Horus Heresy. Absolute helpless defeat, not through superior violence, but through power so far beyond his understanding that fighting it was like an challenging gravity. Whis left them floating there, frozen monuments to futility, and turned his attention to the remaining 5 Chaos ships. He had made his point. Time to finish this. The remaining Chaos ships tried to flee. Warp engines screamed to life, reality tearing open as they attempted to escape back into the tier. It was the first time in recorded history that the Crimson Reavers had retreated from any battle. But Whis was faster. He appeared simultaneously at 5 different locations, one instance of himself at each fleeing ship. The crew saw him through their corrupted viewports, standing in the void with that same serene expression, and felt something their chaos corruption couldn't suppress. Whis touched each ship, and one by one they went dark. Engines failed, warp drives collapsed. The dangings bound within their hulls were dismissed with the same casual efficiency he'd shown everything else. Within 3 minutes, the entire Crimson Reavers warband was neutralized, not destroyed, not killed, simply made irrelevant. 8 ships full of chaos worshippers now drifted as dead tombs, their occupants trapped inside without power, without hope, waiting for either rescue or death by void exposure. Either way, they were no longer a threat. Whis returned to poor Elshir's ship, appearing on the observation deck exactly where he'd left, as if the entire absolute superiority. Executed with the efficiency of a scalpel cutting dead tissue. Poor Elsher's mouth opened and closed several times before she found words. You saved 3 billion lives. Alith is safe because of you. Her voice carried genuine awe mixed with dawning realization of what her people now owed. The tall empire is in your debt. Whis tilted his head considering her statement carefully. She said simply, you are. The acknowledgement hung in the air like a sword suspended by Fred. Poor Elsher's felt her stomach drop. The Imperium had refused help to avoid this exact moment, but the tower had chosen differently, and now they faced the consequence. She steeled herself, drawing on decades of diplomat training, and asked the question that needed asking. What payment do you require? She half expected demands for territory, technology, agents. In her experience, beings with this much power always wanted something concrete. Instead, Whis smiled gently and said something that confused her more than any demand could have. Nothing immediate. The debt will be called when it's needed, not before. It might be tomorrow. It might be 10 years from now. But when I ask the tall empire for aid, you will provide. That's the price of salvage. Paused watching her process. The universe maintains balance. I gave you 3 billion lives. Somewhere the cosmos will record equivalent service from you. Commit to ship. Some had joined them on the observation deck. Her corset bottle suit blocked at the floor. Every weapon system on her arm is still from preparation for a battle that never came. She listened to Whis' explanation with the tactical mind that had won her a dozen impossible victory. This debt, she said carefully. Her voice filtered through her helmet's vox. It's not to you personally, is it? It's to what? Universal balance, cosmic equilibrium. Whis nodded approvingly. Precisely. I'm not a crook to collecting payment. I'm a neutral party who maintains balance. Your empire received a gift of survival. The universe will eventually require compensation, and I'll be the one to inform you when and how. It might be something simple. It might be something that costs everything, but refusing isn't an option, because the debt exists whether you acknowledge it or not. His words were neither neither threatening nor apologetic, just stating how things worked in a framework the Toe had never encountered. The news spread across the Toe empire within hours. The Imperial Envoy, the supreme leader of the Toe, convened an emergency council to discuss the implications. The philosophical debate that erupted with the Imperium's high lords looked unified. By comparison, some Whis argued they had done the right thing, that preserving 3 billion lives justified any future cost. Others claimed it had violated the principles of self-reliance that had built the Toe Empire, that accepting it outside the dangerous precedent that Fire Cost wanted to stop. It wasn't its combat capability. The Earth Coast wanted to understand his technology. The Water Coast wanted to negotiate the terms more clear, and through it all, acceptance and contemplation, considering a question that had no easy answer. Had they saved the people, or had they sold the future? The greater good demanded sacrifice for the collective benefit. But what if the sacrifice came due when they least expected it, demanded by the force they didn't understand? Meanwhile, across the galaxy, other factions began to take note. The Eldari, foreseeing, who could see probability strengths and possible futures, felt their visions distracted by Whis' presence. Where he walked, fate itself became uncertain. The careful plans they had woven across millennia suddenly had a variable they couldn't account for. Eldred Elthrin, oldest and wisest of all folks, stared into his runestones. Sun saw them spell out a message that chilled even his ancient soul. The scales have arrived. The tyrannid have not. That vast alien consciousness consuming its way across the detected Whis detected what? Through the psychic shadow it cast across. Shadow it cast across reality. For the first time in its existence, spanning
millions of years and thousands of galaxies, the hive mind felt something approaching caution. This being registered as neither prey nor threat, simply as incompatible, like trying to digest a concept rather than flesh. The Necrons stirred in their twin worlds, ancient sensor detecting an energy signature that matched nothing in their 60 million year database. Trees in the infinite, the collector of worlds, immediately began planning how to acquire a specimen or at least detailed scans. The Silent King, leading his people in their long journey back to the galaxy, received reports of the anomaly and made a decision that would have surprised his subjects. Avoid contact. The Necrons had fought the Old Ones, had warred against the Kotan, had seen the birth and death of entire species. The Silent King recognized something in Whis' profile that suggested engaging him would be categorically unwanted, not because Whis was hostile, but because he operated on the word. Even the Necrons' reality manipulating technology might prove insufficient. Sometimes the Silent King knew the wisest battle was the one you chose not to fight. Back in the warped, the Chaos Gods held the first informal conference in 10,000 years.
Not a meeting. Exactly. They hated each other too much for that. But a momentary alignment of attention. Four malevolent intelligences focused on the same problem. Whis, Chinch saw opportunity in the debts being created. Khorne wanted blood for the humiliation of his warriors. Nurgle sensed the possibility of infecting something pure. Slaanesh craved the sensation of corrupting perfection. But beneath their individual desires, all four recognized a shared concern. Whis could dismiss their power casually, could walk through the warp untouched, could create effects they couldn't predict or counter. He wasn't a threat to their existence. They were concepts made manifest, impossible to truly destroy as long as sentient beings felt emotion. But he was a threat to their dominance. In a galaxy where chaos had spent millennia becoming the ultimate power, Whis represented something they hadn't encountered in aeons, an equal who didn't acknowledge their authority. That made him dangerous in ways even gods could fear. Whis found them 3 days later, drifting through the webway like ghosts haunting their own civilization. Craft world Ulthway, one of the largest remaining Eldari vessels, hung in the space between dimensions, its wraithbone structure glowing with psychic energy older than human history. The Eldari had been watching him since his arrival in the galaxy, their farseers tracking his movements through probability and prophecy. They knew he would come. What they didn't know was whether his arrival meant salvation or the final nail in their dying species' coffin. Eldrald Ulthrin stood at the craft world's edge, his ancient hands clasped behind his back, his face showing the weariness of someone who had lived too long and seen too much. When Whis materialized beside him, phasing through the webway's walls as if they were suggestions rather than barriers, Eldrald didn't flinch. He simply nodded, the gesture of one elder acknowledging another. "We've been expecting you," he said quietly. Whis studied the craft world with genuine fascination, his eyes taking in the organic architecture, the psychic resonance humming through every surface, the millions of souls living in carefully controlled harmony. But beneath the beauty, he saw the desperation. The Eldari were a species on the brink, clinging to survival through discipline and sacrifice, forever hunted by the chaos god their ancestors had accidentally created. "You're hiding," Whis observed, not unkindly. "Your entire civilization is built around avoiding something's attention, something that wants to consume your souls." He turned to Eldrald, curiosity clear in his expression. "What did your people do to create such a specific predator?" Eldrald's ancient face twitched slightly, old pain surfacing like a wound that never healed. The fall, the birth of Slaanesh, the moment the Eldari Empire burned and took half the galaxy with it. How do you explain that to someone who existed outside their reality's rules? Eldrald gestured for Whis to follow, leading him deeper into the craft world toward the dome of crystal seers. As they walked, the Farseer spoke, his voice carrying 10,000 years of regret. "Once we ruled the galaxy, not through conquest like the humans' attempt, but through mastery. We had transcended material concerns. Our technology was indistinguishable from magic. achieved post-scarcity perfection. He paused at a viewing portal showing the distant Eye of Terror, that massive wound in reality where the Eldari homeworlds once existed, and in our perfection, we became decadent, complacent. We pursued every sensation, every experience, every excess imaginable. For thousands of years we drowned in pleasure and pain, creation and destruction, until our collective psychic resonance in the warp became so intense it achieved consciousness. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. We gave birth to a god, Slaanesh, the prince of excess, and it ate our empire whole. Whis listened without judgment, processing the information with that same analytical curiosity he'd shown everything else. Your species is psychic. Every Eldari soul creates ripples in the warp with their emotions, and you spent millennia generating nothing but extreme sensation. He nodded slowly, understanding crystallizing. You essentially fed something that didn't exist yet until it became powerful enough to materialize. Then it retroactively claimed all of you as its creations and therefore its property. The summary was clinically accurate, stripping away the poetry and leaving only the mechanical horror of what had happened. Eldrad felt a chill run down his spine. Whis had grasped in minutes what had taken the surviving Eldari centuries to understand. Yes, now every Eldari soul belongs to Slaanesh. When we die, if we die without protection, she who thirsts consumes us, tortures us for eternity. We survive only through these craft worlds, through soul stones that capture our essence, through constant vigilance against the god we created. They entered the dome where hundreds of Farseers sat in meditation, their consciousness spread across time and space, constantly weaving probability to keep their species alive one more day. Whis observed them with something approaching sadness. This is no way to exist, he said quietly. Your entire species living in constant fear, every action calculated to avoid attracting attention, every soul precious because you have so few left. He turned to Eldrad. In my universe we have rules that prevent this kind of catastrophic mistake. Safeguards, training, oversight from beings whose job is maintaining balance. His implication was clear. The Eldari had advanced technologically, but remained dangerously naive about the consequences of psychic power. They had been children playing with cosmic forces, and Slaanesh was the price of their ignorance. How many of you survived the fall? Whis asked. Eldrad's answer came heavy with extinction-level grief. Billions died in the first moment. Now perhaps a few billion remain across all craft worlds combined. From an empire of trillions. Whis was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight it rarely held. I could kill Slaanesh. The statement fell like a meteor strike. Every Farseer in the dome snapped to attention, their meditations broken by the sheer impossibility of what they'd just heard. Eldrad's hands trembled, his ancient composure cracking. What? The word came out strangled, disbelieving. Whis continued calmly. Slaanesh is a warp entity sustained by emotional resonance and stolen souls. I could enter the Imperium, locate the core of what she is and simply erase it, not permanently. Eventually enough excess in the galaxy would spawn something similar, but for several millennia at least, long enough for your species to die naturally rather than being tortured eternally. He tilted his head, studying Eldrad's reaction. That would interest you, wouldn't it? Freedom from she who thirsts. Release from the constant terror of soul consumption. Eldrad felt hope surge through him. Genuine hope for the first time in 10,000 years, followed immediately by crushing suspicion. In his long life he had learned one universal truth. Nothing came free, especially not miracles. What would it cost? He asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotional storm raging inside him. Whis smiled, and this time there was approval in the expression. You're wiser than the tall. They asked for help before considering the price. You consider the price before accepting the help. He gestured to the craft world around them, to the millions of Eldari living their careful, constrained lives. The cost would be simple. The Eldari would owe a service to cosmic balance, something equivalent to destroying a chaos god. I don't know what that would be yet. It would depend on what the universe needs when the debt comes due. But it would be significant, possibly existential, possibly more costly than the eternal damnation situation you currently face. The choice that had haunted the Imperium and now burdened the Tall was being offered to the Eldari with perfect clarity. Freedom from Slaanesh, in exchange for an undefined future obligation that might destroy them just as thoroughly. Eldrad's mind raced through probability strands, seeing futures branch and diverge. In timelines where they accepted, some showed the Eldari finally free to live without fear, rebuilding their civilization, reclaiming their dignity. Others showed them called upon to make sacrifices that made the fall look merciful. In timelines where they refused, the slow extinction continued, each generation smaller than the last, until the craft worlds were nothing but ghost ships carrying the final dying memories of a species that once ruled the stars. There was no good choice. There was only the question of which doom they preferred, the one they knew or the one they didn't. Eldrad closed his eyes, drawing on thousands of years of wisdom, and made a decision that would define the Eldari's fate for the next 10 millennia. We refuse. The answer surprised Whis, his eyebrows raising slightly. Interesting. Why? Eldrad opened his eyes, and in them was the terrible clarity of someone who had accepted their species' extinction long ago. Because Slaanesh is our sin, our responsibility, our creation. Asking someone else to clean up our catastrophic mistake while we escape the consequences would be wrong, morally, spiritually, cosmically wrong. He gestured to the farseers around them, to the craft world beyond, to the scattered remnants of the Eldari Empire. We are a dying species, but we will die with our dignity intact. We will face the God we created and fight it until the last soul flickers out. That is the only redemption available to us. Accepting your offer would be another form of decadence, another refusal to accept the consequences of our actions, and we've learned where that path leads. Whis was quiet for a long moment, then nodded with genuine respect. That, he said softly, is the wisest choice anyone in this galaxy has made since I arrived. Whis left the craft world with more questions than answers. 3 civilizations, 3 different responses to his presence. The Imperium chose paranoid self-reliance. The Tall chose pragmatic survival. The Eldari chose dignified extinction. Each choice reflected their nature, their history, their relationship with consequence. But Whis still hadn't seen the full picture of this galaxy's horror. He hadn't witnessed the daily grind of Imperial life, the meat grinder that consumed trillions of souls to keep the Imperium functioning for one more day. He decided to observe what he'd been avoiding, the price humanity paid for its survival. He chose a world at random from the millions burning across the galaxy, Armageddon, a hive world where war was eternal and suffering was currency. He descended through the polluted atmosphere unseen, passing manufacturing sectors the size of continents, seeing what humanity had become in its desperation to survive. The hive cities rose like metal mountains, each one housing billions of souls crammed into spaces designed for millions. Whis walked invisible through the lower levels where sunlight was a myth and breathable air was a luxury. He saw children working in Promethean refineries, their small hands perfect for reaching into machinery that killed them by the thousands. He saw workers chained to their stations, cybernetically modified to never sleep, producing ammunition for wars on worlds they'd never seen. He saw corpse starch being processed from the dead, feeding the living in an endless cycle of consumption. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was efficiency. The Imperium needed every bullet, every body, every ounce of production to survive against the horrors pressing in from all sides. But the cost was humanity itself, reduced to biological components in a machine that never stopped grinding. In Hive Tartarus, Whis witnessed something that gave him pause for the first time since arriving. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood in line with 10,000 others. They were waiting to be processed by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, tested for psychic potential. The girl clutched a warm doll, her eyes wide with fear she didn't understand. Whis followed her through the testing. The detection servitors confirmed it. She was a psyker, low-grade, barely able to create sparks with her mind, but in the Imperium that was enough. She was dragged screaming from her mother's arms, thrown onto a transport with hundreds of others, all crying, all terrified. Whis followed that transport, watched it load onto a black ship, those dread vessels that harvested psychers across the galaxy. He followed the black ship back to Terra, watched the girl and thousands like her processed through the tithing chambers. Most would feed the golden throne, their
souls burned as fuel to keep the astronomical lit. 1,000 lives every day ground to psychic ash so the Imperium ships could navigate the warp. The girl was among those chosen. She was dragged to the throne itself, to the vast chamber where the Emperor sat as a corpse sustained by will and sacrifice. She was strapped into the feeding mechanism, still clutching that warm doll, still calling for her mother. Then the process began. Her soul was drawn out, painfully, slowly feeding the Emperor's consciousness one thread at a time. She screamed for hours before there was nothing left but a withered husk that had once been a child. And this happened every day, every single day. 1,000 souls, most of them children or young adults, burned alive to maintain humanity's lighthouse. Whis stood in that chamber, and for the first time since arriving in Warhammer 40k, his expression showed something other than curiosity. Grief, deep, profound grief at what survival had required these people to become. This is the price. He whispered to himself, this is what it cost to exist in a dying universe. The Emperor felt Whis' presence in the throne room and sent a psychic message, weak but clear. You understand now. This is what they call the Imperium of men. This is what I built to save them. This is the price of our continued existence. The message carried no pride, no justification, just exhausted acknowledgement of what he had become. A god fed by the souls of children, sustained by the very sacrifice he once fought to prevent. The Emperor had been human once, had dreamed of enlightenment and progress, had wanted to lift humanity to greatness. Instead, he had created a machine of meat and faith that ground up lives to produce one more day of survival. And the worst part, the truly soul-crushing truth, was that it worked. The Imperium endured. Humanity survived. The species that had crawled out of old Earth millennia ago still held territory across the galaxy because a dying god consumed 1,000 souls. Necessity was the cruelest teacher in existence. Whis left Terra and traveled to an agri-world, thinking perhaps there he would find something less grim. He found only a different flavor of horror. Billions of workers harvesting crops under the watchful gaze of administratum overseers, their productivity measured to the second, their food rations calculated to keep them barely alive enough to work. Children born into the fields would die in the fields, never seeing anything but wheat and mud in the distant processing plants where their labor was transformed into food for worlds they'd never visit. On a forge world, he watched tech priests modify workers into servitors, lobotomizing criminals and dissidents, turning them into biological robots that served the mechanicus without complaint or consciousness. On a penal world, he saw prisoners forced to mine radioactive ore with their bare hands, their life expectancy measured in weeks, their bodies disposed of in mass graves when the radiation finally killed them. Every world told the same story: survival through suffering, existence through sacrifice, hope through endless grinding horror. But then Whis witnessed something that genuinely surprised him. On a battlefield where Imperial Guard fought orcs in eternal stalemate, he watched a commissar execute a soldier for cowardice. The man had hesitated, advancing into certain death, and for that moment of humanity he received a bolt round through the skull. The commissar's expression showed no satisfaction, no cruelty, just tired necessity. Then something unexpected happened. The other soldiers didn't break, didn't flee, didn't rebel. They charged forward, screaming litanies of faith, throwing themselves at the orc lines with renewed fury. The dead man became a martyr in seconds, his sacrifice inspiring the very courage his death was meant to enforce. Whis watched this pattern repeat across the battlefield. Humans dying by the thousands, yet every death seemed to strengthen rather than weaken those who remained. It was psychologically impossible, theologically irrational, yet it worked because they believed it worked. Their faith, genuine and absolute, created reality. Then he turned his attention to the orcs themselves and found something even more fascinating. The greenskins operated on logic that shouldn't function. Their technology worked because they believed it worked. Guns fired because they thought guns should fire. Vehicles ran on fuel that shouldn't combust. Their entire species was a reality warping field of collective belief, unconsciously psychic, bending the laws of physics through sheer conviction that their way was correct. A red vehicle went faster because orcs believed red was the fastest color. A larger orc was stronger because size equaled power in their collective consciousness. It was insanity given form and function. Whis stood between the battle lines, invisible to both sides, and realized something profound about this universe. It wasn't just damaged or corrupt. stood alone against an orc charge that should have crushed him. The man was terrified. Whis could see it in his trembling hands, his rapid breathing, the tears streaming down his dirt-caked face. But he didn't run. He whispered a prayer to the Emperor, raised his last gun and fired until the power pack ran dry. Then he drew his knife, screamed his defiance, and charged. He died in seconds, torn apart by orc cleavers. But his death bought time for reinforcements to arrive. His squad was avenged. The line held, and somewhere in the warp the Emperor's consciousness registered one more soul offered in absolute faith, one more thread added to the vast tapestry of human belief that kept him conscious despite his body's death. Whis finally understood. This wasn't just survival, it was transformation. Humanity was becoming something else, something sustained by faith and suffering in equal measure. They were evolving into a species that could survive anything because they believed they deserved to. It was horrifying, inspirational, and utterly unique to this broken galaxy. Whis stood at the edge of the galaxy, looking back at the spiral of stars and suffering he had spent weeks observing. Behind him the void between galaxies stretched infinite and empty. Before him the Milky Way burned with war, faith, corruption, and desperate survival. He had seen everything this reality had to offer. The Imperium's grinding horror machine, the Tau's naive optimism, the Eldari's dignified extinction, the Orc's reality warping joy of violence, the Necron's cold awakening, the Tyranid's endless hunger, and beneath it all the warp that warped that roiling sea of emotion and madness that fed on every species equally. Whis had traveled to countless universes in his role as attendant to Lord Beers. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, species ascend to godhood or descend into extinction, but he had never encountered a galaxy quite like this one, a place where suffering was currency and faith shaped reality, where the only constants were war and death, yet species endured through sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. The Chaos Gods watched him from the warp, their attention focused like laser fire. They had been waiting for this moment for Whis to make his judgment. Would he declare their galaxy irredeemable? Would he attempt to cleanse it, to impose order on their beautiful chaos? Would he ally with one faction against another, tipping the eternal stalemate that had defined galactic politics for millennia? Patient calculated 10,000 possible outcomes. Khorne prepared for violence. Nurgle spread his influence wider, hoping to catch Whis in a moment of weakness. Slanesh simply watched with hungry eyes, still craving the impossible corruption of something pure. But Whis surprised them all by doing none of the things they expected. Instead, he closed his eyes and spoke to the galaxy itself, his voice carrying through both material reality and the immaterial. I have seen your suffering. I have witnessed your horror. I understand now what you are. Across the galaxy, every psyker, every farseer, every shaman and witch and sorcerer felt Wiz's words resonating through the warp. On Terra, the Emperor's consciousness focused entirely on Whis for the first time since their initial contact. On Craft Worlds, the Eldari held their breath. In Tau Space, Commander Shadowsun stopped mid-sentence in a tactical briefing. Even the orcs posed in their eternal fighting, feeling something in the fabric of reality shift. Whis continued his tone, neither condemning nor approving, simply stating truth. You are a galaxy in its death throes. Your reality is collapsing inward, consumed by the emotional waste products of trillions of sentient beings. Your warp is not an invader. It is your collective unconscious given form and hunger. Every species here feeds it. Every emotion strengthens it. Every death adds to its mass. You are dying because you cannot stop feeling, and cause to stop feeling because to do so would make you less than alive. The words hit like a judge's verdict, stripping away comfortable lies and forced optimism. The Imperium told itself it was protecting humanity. The Taus claimed they were spreading the greater good. The Eldari believed they were atoning for their sins. The Chaos Gods insisted they were the natural evolution of consciousness. But Wiz's assessment revealed the underlying truth. They were all participants in a slow-motion apocalypse, each playing their part in a tragedy that had been unfolding for millions of years. The warp existed because sentient beings existed. The Chaos Gods fed because those beings felt emotion. The endless war continued because war generated the emotions that sustained the very entities making war necessary. It was a perfect cycle of suffering that would only end when the last conscious being died, or when something fundamentally changed about how expected challenge, the Eldari expected pity, but Whis offered something none of them anticipated: validation. In my role as attendant to a god of destruction, I have watched universes be erased because they became stagnant, broken beyond repair, or simply redundant. I have seen civilizations that had everything: peace, prosperity, immortality, choose to end themselves out of boredom. I have witnessed species that were so perfect they stopped evolving, stopped growing, stopped mattering. But you fight, you suffer, you sacrifice, you endure horrors that would break other galaxies completely, and you refuse to surrender. Whis' expression softened with something approaching admiration. The Imperium sacrifices children to keep its god alive, yet those children go to their deaths believing it matters. The Taus accept debts they don't understand to save their people. The Eldari choose extinction over escaping their sins. Humanity transforms faith into reality through sheer conviction. The orcs create physics through belief. Even your chaos gods, parasitic as they are, represent genuine aspects of consciousness: ambition, rage, despair, desire. This galaxy is a crucible that burns away everything except will, and what remains is powerful precisely because it has survived the burning. He paused, letting his words sink in. In other universes, beings as damaged as your emperor would have been destroyed out of mercy. Civilizations as corrupt as the Imperium would have been cleansed. But here, that damage and corruption is what keeps you alive. You have weaponized your own suffering. That is horrifying. It is also remarkable. The Emperor understood first. Through his fragmented consciousness, he grasped what Whis was Risley saying. This galaxy didn't need saving, didn't need healing, didn't need intervention. It needed to be left alone to continue its agonizing evolution, because the alternative imposed peace, forced balance, external salvation would rob its inhabitants of the very struggle that defined them. They were becoming something new, something that could only exist through suffering, something that might in another 100,000 years emerge from the crucible as beings who had earned their strength through endless trial. The Emperor sent a message to Whis: weak but grateful. Thank you for understanding what I could not explain. We are not victims, we are not victims, we are becoming. Whis nodded to the distant golden throne, acknowledging the dying god's wisdom. Yes, and that process cannot be rushed or aided without destroying what you are becoming. Whis turned toward the void, preparing to leave. But before he departed, he left the galaxy with final words that would echo through the millennia. I will not interfere further. The Taus owe their debt to cosmic balance, and someday I or another will return to collect. But until then, fight your wars, worship your gods, feed your corruption, sacrifice your children, do what you must to survive. Because in surviving against impossible odds, you prove something that beings like me sometimes forget. His voice carried genuine warmth. Consciousness is precious precisely because it can suffer and choose to continue anyway. You are not broken, you are not dying, you are being forged. And what emerges from this galaxy in the far future, if anything emerges at all, will be something the universe has never seen before. Something earned through blood and faith and 10,000 generations of refusing to quit. That is worth preserving, that is worth respecting, that is worth leaving alone. Then Whis vanished, not into the war but through the dimensional barriers between realities, returning to his own universe where gods destroyed and created with purpose rather than malice, where balance was maintained by beings dedicated to cosmic harmony. He left behind a galaxy forever changed by his brief visit. The Imperium knew now that their suffering had meaning beyond survival, that they were evolving into something unprecedented. The Taus carried their debt with new understanding of cosmic balance. The Eldari felt validated in their choice to face extinction with dignity. The Chaos Gods realized that even they served a purpose in the grand design, however twisted. And across a million worlds and a billion minds, a single thought crystallized: they would endure. Not because they were saved, not because they were redeemed, but because in this galaxy of eternal war and endless night, the only victory that mattered was waking up for one more day and choosing to fight for one more hour. Whis had witnessed their horror and called it transformation. He had seen their damnation and called it evolution. And in doing so, he had given them something this galaxy desperately needed but rarely received: recognition that their suffering mattered, that their struggle had purpose, that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is also meaning, and meaning, even wrapped in horror, is enough to justify another 10,000 years of survival. The